They mocked her civilian flying background until she landed a damaged F-22 on a moving aircraft carrier in a storm. This story begins 3 years ago at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where Lieutenant Sarah Maverick Chen was completing her transition training from civilian pilot to military aviator. At 26 years old, Sarah was older than most new pilots entering the Air Force, having spent 6 years flying everything from crop dusters to charter flights in her home state of Iowa before enlisting. The other pilots in her squadron never let her forget it. "Hey Chen, this isn't a cornfield," called out Captain Jake Viper Morrison as Sarah walked toward the flight line. "You sure you can handle something that doesn't have propellers?" Lieutenant Brad Thunder Williams laughed from the cockpit of his F-16. "I heard she used to give flying lessons to farmers. Think she knows what a supersonic aircraft even looks like?" Major Frank Bulldog Stevens, the squadron commander, was more direct in his assessment. "Chen, I don't care what you flew before, but civilian aviation is finger painting compared to what we do here. You're going to have to prove you belong in this squadron every single day." Sarah had heard it all before. During her 6 months at flight school, instructors had questioned whether someone with her limited background could handle the demands of military aviation. Her fellow trainees had nicknamed her crop duster and made jokes about her needing GPS to find the runway. But Sarah had something they didn't understand: 10,000 hours of flying experience in conditions that would terrify most military pilots. She had flown through Iowa tornadoes to deliver medical supplies. She had landed on dirt strips in zero visibility during blizzards. She had nursed dying engines across 3 states with nothing but intuition and prayer. Rehook 1. But what happened next defied every law of physics. The mission briefing came on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest supercarrier, was conducting joint operations with the Air Force 200 miles off the coast of Virginia. A massive storm system, Hurricane Isabella, was bearing down on the eastern seaboard with Category 4 winds and 40-foot seas. "This is a routine training exercise," explained Colonel James Hawk Patterson, the air group commander. "We're going to practice carrier landings in challenging weather conditions. The Navy needs to know our F-22s can operate from their deck in less than ideal circumstances." Sarah raised her hand. "Sir, what's the ceiling on those weather conditions?" Patterson's expression showed his irritation. "Chen, the F-22 Raptor is the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. It's designed to operate in any weather condition on the planet. Are you suggesting you can't handle it?" "No, sir, just checking the parameters," Captain Morrison snorted. "Maybe we should get Chen a weather vane for her cockpit, like they use on barns." The laughter from the other pilots stung, but Sarah had learned to channel that energy into focus. She had been underestimated her entire life, first as a woman in a male-dominated industry, then as a civilian pilot trying to make it in the military. But every challenge had made her stronger, more determined to prove that experience counted for more than pedigree. 4 hours later, Sarah was strapped into the cockpit of Raptor 007, her F-22 loaded with training ordnance and configured for carrier operations. The aircraft was a marvel of engineering. Twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines capable of supercruise, advanced stealth technology, and fly-by-wire controls that could compensate for pilot error. But as Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The weather reports were getting worse by the hour. Hurricane Isabella had intensified unexpectedly, and the seas around the Ford were now running 45 feet with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour. "Tower, this is Maverick requesting updated weather conditions," Sarah radioed. "Maverick, this is Tower. Current conditions at the carrier. Winds 080 at 35 knots, gusting to 55. Seas 8 to 12 feet. Visibility 2 miles in heavy rain. Mission is still a go." Sarah frowned. Those numbers didn't match what she was seeing on her weather radar. Her civilian flying experience had taught her to read weather patterns with an intuition that came from years of flying in the Midwest, where conditions could change from clear skies to deadly storms in minutes. Rehook 2. And that's when her civilian training became her greatest weapon. The flight to the carrier began normally enough. Sarah's F-22 performed flawlessly as she climbed to 35,000 feet and headed east toward the Atlantic. Behind her, Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Williams flew in loose formation, their own Raptors cutting through the darkening sky. But 30 minutes into the flight, Sarah's weather radar lit up like a Christmas tree. The storm system ahead was massive, easily twice the size that had been briefed, with wind shears that could tear an aircraft apart and cloud tops reaching 60,000 feet. "Control, this is Maverick. I'm seeing severe weather ahead that wasn't in the briefing. Recommend we abort and return to base." Colonel Patterson's voice crackled through the radio. "Negative, Maverick. The mission is a go. The Navy is expecting us, and we don't turn around because of a little rain." Morrison's voice followed. "Come on, crop duster. Don't tell me you're scared of a little turbulence. We're not flying paper airplanes here." But Sarah's instincts were screaming danger. In her years of civilian flying, she had learned to trust her gut over official weather reports. Meteorologists could be wrong, radar could lie, but the feeling in her stomach when conditions were about to turn deadly, that was never wrong. As they approached the storm's outer bands, the turbulence began. At first, it was manageable, the kind of light chop that military pilots trained for regularly. But Sarah could feel the air getting angrier, the wind shears becoming more violent. Her F-22's advanced flight control systems were working overtime to keep the aircraft stable, but Sarah could sense something that the computers couldn't. This storm was alive, predatory, looking for weakness to exploit. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered to herself, adjusting her flight path to find smoother air. 20 minutes later, they were in the heart of Hurricane Isabella, and Sarah's worst fears were being realized. The turbulence was so severe that she could barely read her instruments. Her F-22 was being thrown around like a toy, climbing and diving thousands of feet despite her best efforts to maintain altitude. "Control, this is Viper." Morrison's voice was strained. "We're taking a beating up here. My aircraft is handling it, but this is worse than briefed." "Roger, Viper. Continue to the carrier. You're almost through the worst of it." But Sarah knew they weren't almost through anything. Her weather radar showed the storm was getting worse, not better. The eye wall was still 50 miles away, and between them and the carrier was a wall of wind and rain that would challenge even the most advanced aircraft ever built. Rehook 3. Little did they know, her amateur background was about to save everyone. That's when it happened. Sarah was fighting to keep her F-22 level when she heard a sound that every pilot dreads, the grinding whine of a compressor stall in her left engine. Immediately, warning lights flooded her cockpit like angry red stars. "Engine failure, left engine," flashed across her primary display. The F-22 lurched violently to the left as the failed engine created massive asymmetric thrust. Sarah fought the controls, using every ounce of her strength to keep the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable spin. "Mayday, mayday, this is Maverick. I have catastrophic engine failure and am declaring an emergency." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Maverick, what's your status?" "Single engine failure, severe turbulence, and I'm losing hydraulic pressure. The storm is tearing my aircraft apart." Colonel Patterson's voice was grim. "Maverick, can you make it back to Nellis?" Sarah checked her fuel gauges and did quick mental calculations, the kind of seat-of-the-pants math that civilian pilots learn to do instinctively. "Negative. I don't have the fuel or the aircraft performance to make it back. I need to get to the carrier." "Impossible," Patterson replied. "Carrier landings in these conditions with a damaged aircraft are suicide. You need to eject while you still can." But Sarah's civilian flying background had taught her something that military pilots often forgot. Sometimes the impossible was just difficult, and sometimes difficult was survivable if you had the right skills and the right mindset. "Control, I'm not ejecting. I can land this aircraft." Morrison's voice was incredulous. "Chen, you're talking about landing a single-engine F-22 with failing hydraulics on a carrier deck that's pitching 30 feet in 50-knot winds. That's not flying. That's controlled crashing." "Sir, with respect, I've been landing broken aircraft in impossible conditions my entire flying career. This is just another runway that happens to be moving." Rehook 4. The next 30 seconds would rewrite aviation history. Sarah began her approach to the USS Gerald R. Ford under conditions that would have challenged a fully functional aircraft with perfect weather. She had one engine producing partial thrust, hydraulic systems that were failing by the minute, and flight controls that were becoming less responsive with each passing second. But she also had something that no simulator could teach and no amount of military training could replicate: an intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved when they were dying. In her civilian days, Sarah had coaxed countless aircraft home with failed engines, broken control surfaces, and systems that should have made flight impossible. She had learned to feel what an aircraft needed, to sense its moods and compensate for its weaknesses. Now, 200 feet above the storm-tossed Atlantic, she put those skills to the ultimate test. The carrier deck was a moving target in the most literal sense. The Ford was pitching nose up and nose down through 40-foot arcs, while simultaneously rolling side to side through 15-degree angles. The landing area was appearing and disappearing behind walls of spray as 50-foot waves crashed over the bow. Maverick, this is Ford approach control. Current deck conditions are, well, they're about as bad as they get. Winds are 070 at 45 knots, gusting to 65. Deck is pitching plus or minus 20 degrees. Recommend you divert to Norfolk. Ford approach, I don't have the fuel to divert. I'm committed to your deck. Sarah could hear the strain in the approach controller's voice. Roger, Maverick. You're cleared for emergency approach. Good luck. As Sarah lined up for her final approach, every instinct she had developed over 10,000 hours of flying kicked in. She could feel the wind patterns through the aircraft's behavior, sense the carrier's movement through subtle changes in the visual picture, and anticipate the ocean's rhythm through years of reading natural patterns. The F-22 was barely controllable now. The remaining engine was running rough, producing unpredictable thrust that made maintaining airspeed nearly impossible. The hydraulic system had failed completely, leaving Sarah with manual reversion controls that required enormous physical strength to operate. But Sarah had learned something in her civilian flying career that military pilots rarely experienced: how to become one with a dying aircraft, to stop fighting it and start working with it. Rehook 5. And in that moment, the underdog became the legend. At 150 feet above the deck, Sarah's F-22 was wallowing through the air like a wounded bird. The crosswinds were pushing her left and right of the center line, while the carrier's movement made it nearly impossible to judge the correct glide path. In the squadron ready room aboard the Ford, pilots from both services watched in horrified fascination as approach radar tracked Maverick's erratic path toward the deck. "She's never going to make it," whispered one Navy pilot. "That approach is all over the sky." But Sarah wasn't flying a normal approach. She was using every technique she had learned, flying into tiny dirt strips in crosswinds, every skill she had developed nursing sick aircraft across impossible distances. Instead of fighting the wind, she was using it. Instead of forcing the aircraft to behave normally, she was working with its damaged systems. At 50 feet, a massive gust of wind pushed her F-22 30 degrees off the center line. Any normal pilot would have called for a go-around, but Sarah had seen this exact situation 100 times in civilian flying. She applied opposite rudder and used the wind's energy to slide the aircraft back toward the center, a technique called crabbing that most military pilots never mastered. At 30 feet, the carrier deck disappeared behind a wall of spray as a massive wave crashed over the bow. Sarah couldn't see her landing area, but her years of flying in zero visibility had taught her to trust her instruments and her instincts. She held her approach path steady, knowing that the deck would reappear. At 10 feet, everything came together. The carrier's deck emerged from the spray just as Sarah's F-22 reached the perfect position, but the deck was pitching downward at 15 degrees, creating a landing target that was falling away from her aircraft. This was the moment where civilian flying experience made all the difference. In her crop-dusting days, Sarah had landed on hundreds of sloping fields, adjusting her touchdown point based on terrain that was never perfectly level. Now she used those same skills, adjusting her approach to match the deck's angle and timing her touchdown for the precise moment when the carrier's movement would work in her favor. The F-22 touched down hard but controlled, the arresting hook catching the three-wire with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. Sarah was thrown forward against her harness as 30 tons of aircraft decelerated from 140 miles per hour to 0 in less than 300 feet. For a moment, there was absolute silence on the radio. Then, the Ford's approach controller's voice came through, filled with amazement. "Maverick, that was the most incredible landing I've ever seen. Welcome aboard." Aftermath and recognition. The storm continued to rage for another 6 hours, but Sarah's F-22 was safely secured in the Ford's hangar bay. The damage assessment revealed that her aircraft had suffered not just engine failure, but also hydraulic system failure, partial flight control failure, and structural damage that should have made controlled flight impossible. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Williams, who had been diverted to Norfolk when their own aircraft began showing stress fractures from the turbulence, flew out to the carrier the next morning. Morrison found Sarah in the squadron ready room, studying weather patterns on a computer terminal. "Chen," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We all do." Sarah looked up from the screen. "For what?" "For thinking your civilian background was a weakness. What you did yesterday? None of us could have pulled that off. You didn't just land an aircraft, you defied physics." Williams nodded in agreement. "The Navy pilots are calling it the greatest carrier landing in history. They want to study the video frame by frame to understand how you did it. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Colonel Patterson, who visited Sarah later that day. "Chen, I've been flying for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did yesterday. Your civilian experience wasn't a handicap. It was exactly what saved your life and probably several others." "How do you figure that, sir?" "If you had ejected over the Atlantic in those conditions, the search and rescue crews would have been flying into the same storm that nearly killed your aircraft. Your decision to land probably saved half a dozen lives beyond your own." The lesson. The story of Sarah Maverick Chen's impossible landing became legend throughout the Air Force and Navy, but Sarah herself drew a different lesson from the experience than most people expected. It wasn't about proving that civilian pilots are better than military pilots, she explained to a reporter months later. It was about understanding that every type of flying experience has value. My civilian background taught me things that military training couldn't, but military training taught me things that civilian flying couldn't. The combination made me a better pilot than either one alone. The F-22 that Sarah had landed was eventually repaired and returned to service, but not before engineers studied every aspect of her approach and landing. Her techniques for flying damaged aircraft in extreme weather conditions became part of the curriculum at the Air Force Test Pilot School. Captain Morrison, who had once mocked her crop duster background, became one of her strongest advocates. "Sarah taught us all something important," he said. "Experience is experience, no matter where you get it. She had 10,000 hours of flying in conditions that most of us had never imagined, and when the impossible happened, that experience saved her life." Legacy. Today, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Maverick Chen commands her own squadron and is considered one of the Air Force's premier test pilots. The techniques she developed for extreme weather flying and emergency landings are taught throughout the military. But she never forgot the lesson of that storm-tossed day over the Atlantic, that the skills others might mock could become the tools of survival, and that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the experiences that make you different, not the ones that make you the same. The squadron that once called her crop duster now calls her Miracle, but Sarah prefers her original call sign, Maverick. Because sometimes being different isn't a weakness. It's exactly what the situation demands. And on days when young pilots ask her for advice about overcoming challenges and proving themselves, Sarah always tells them the same thing. Don't let anyone tell you that your background is wrong for this job. Every hour you've flown, every challenge you've faced, every time you've been underestimated, those aren't obstacles. They're preparation for the moment when everyone else gives up and you're the only one left who knows what to do. Because sometimes the most impossible landings are made possible by the most unexpected experience, And sometimes the greatest victories come from the skills that others never thought to value.